Welcome to the show, everyone. Danny Haifeng here. First, some news. As you can see, I'm joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi. Overnight, the United States struck Iran in the area of Sirik near the Strait of Hormuz. Multiple areas were hit. Sent published this video as quote unquote evidence of their strike. And Iran has said that they have retaliated, and Bahrain announced earlier this morning that a drone attack occurred in the early hours in retaliation by Iran. Of course, this all comes as tensions in the Strait of Hormuz are rising. The United States, J.D. Vance has said that there is going to be violence for violence if attacks in the Strait of Hormuz continues. As you can see, I am joined by Professor Mohammad Marandi to discuss all of this and more. Professor Marandi, good to see you again.
Hi, Danny. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure being with you.
Of course, hit the like button, everyone, as we get started. So, yes, Professor Marandi, your reactions to the developments. This is the first strike since the Memorandum of Understanding began or was signed by both parties. Now it seems like Iran is considering suspending it altogether after this act of aggression. Your reaction and what it means for the overall trajectory of this.
Well, the Americans are violating the MOU as expected. The Iranians never believed that the United States had any intention of voluntarily carrying out its commitments. But the Iranians, in return for all U.S. violations, are to make it more difficult for the United States in the Strait of Hormuz. And the Americans have violated its commitments to the situation in Lebanon. The Israeli regime continues to occupy enormous parts of southern Lebanon and to carry out strikes. All of that must come to an end in accordance with the deal. That's the first article in the MOU. The United States has been trying to undermine Iran's authority in the Strait of Hormuz by forcing Oman to declare an open corridor. That's another violation. The U.S. constant threats against Iran. Trump, again, during the negotiations, spoke of murdering the negotiators and destroying Iran and threatened the president. All of these are violations. So the United States violates the deal on all fronts, including releasing Iranian assets. That's also been something that's slow. It's of course, what Trump said about Iran's assets that are to be released are not true about purchasing American agricultural products and not having control over their assets. But in any case, the United States is in violation. So the Iranians warned these ships not to go through. One ship ignored Iran's authorities, military, and the Iranian, and that struck. Iran did not, of course, take any responsibility, but it's obvious what happened. So the Americans struck last night. It wasn't a very important strike. They hit, I think, a tower, which is made in Iran. They'll replace it. The Iranians retaliated by striking Bahrain. And again, today, another ship was struck, sending another message that only the Iranian declared corridor is acceptable. Some ships do go through. They smaller ships, they cling to the Omani shore. They go from the Emirates to alongside, very close to the Omani shore, and then go to the Fujairah port. But they're small ships, and then they transport their goods to bigger ships, to like big tankers, and then a number of them have to go through to fill up a tanker. So some do go through, and it seems that the Iranians are tolerating that. But for the most part, the number of ships that go back and forth are down. They're not near as much as they were before the war, and that's because of the U.S. Inaction with regards to the MOU. The United States, if they carry out their commitments, the Iranians will carry out theirs. If the United States doesn't, the Iranians won't either. If the United States goes halfway, then the Iranians are going to go halfway. The difference between The situation now and before is that the Iranians, in previous agreements with the United States, is that this time around, the Iranians are not going to carry out or fulfill their obligations and carry out their commitments unless the Americans do.
Well, I want to pull up now the Iranian military announcement after the attacks on Syriac, because I think one thing that I find interesting is that Iran says that their naval and air forces were able to thwart and foil the attack and force the attacking forces to retreat, preserving Iranian sovereignty over its land and its waters. So I'm wondering, Professor Marandi, does Iran even view these attacks as very significant if they are having like in terms of the damage and the proportionality of it, how they respond, given that they say that they were able to thwart it? I assume that means air defenses and other means and methods to ensure the attack was very short-lived by the United States. But your thoughts on this?
I don't know the details, but what I do know is that nothing of importance was struck. And whether that's because it was thwarted or the Americans didn't intend to do much or a combination of both, I don't know. But the Iranian response, I would imagine, more heavy-handed than the U.S. strike, because that's how Iran has been doing things during the last month or so. Over the last month, every time the United States violates the ceasefire, the Iranians hit harder in response. In the past, it was proportionate, but in previous ceasefire violations. But now it's been different. So I would imagine that the Iranians hit a bit harder, but I don't know exactly what the Iranians have done.
According to NBC News and other sources, it's being reported that the Trump administration timed this attack to align with the closing of the markets in the United States. And we are seeing constantly, whenever this is happening, we saw this before the MOU was signed, when Iran and the United States were going back and forth. The U.S. would attack, Iran would strike back. Also around the Strait of Hormuz area, we would see very little come out. And then, of course, CENTCOM publishes the video I put up, which shows very little. I mean, CENTCOM, it's unclassified information, but it simply just shows plumes of smoke coming out. It doesn't show any much detail. What do you make of this? It feels like this war has only become more and more censored, especially by the U.S. side.
Well, I think the war has been unique, that we only discovered the immense amount of damage after the war. I mean, everything that the Iranians said turned out to be true. If you recall, after General Soleimani was murdered, the Iranians carried out a missile strike on a U.S. base in northern Iraq and did a lot of damage, but it really wasn't reported back then. And only later did we find out that there was really heavy damage done, and that there were significant casualties. But this time around, it's been the entire war has been full of hidden the U.S. military either lying or hiding facts, and the Iranians have been much more accurate in reporting on what was going on inside the country than the Americans reporting on what was going on inside their military bases.
Yeah, and here's the report that the United States, the Pentagon, delayed publicly notifying or announcing the strikes on Iran until after the stock market closed, 4 p.m. Eastern time on Friday, to reduce the immediate impact on the markets. And that seems to be a big concern here, where you have the oil price of oil going down after the memorandum of understanding, yet still a lot of concern about managing the situation. The United States came out right after these strikes and said, this does not torpedo the memorandum of understanding for them. This is not a return to war. But a ceasefire violation is a ceasefire violation, Professor Marandi. In all intents and purposes, when the U.S. attacked Iran, the ceasefire is completely broken, no? And not to mention the situation in Lebanon, which is only getting worse after this so-called agreement that the so-called government that is being protested heavily in the streets of Beirut right now decided to engage with and agree upon with the U.S. and Israel. Your thoughts?
Oh yes, the United States is violating that on multiple accounts, and the so-called agreement in Lebanon, which was signed by the government, which is a proxy government. The president and the prime minister were installed by the Americans. No one should think that they were chosen by the politicians who were elected. The Americans imposed them on the country, and they've been carrying out policies that have been dictated to them by the Americans, just like the government in Syria. And so the agreement between this government and Lebanon, first of all, the very fact that they negotiate with the Israelis is a violation of Lebanese law. But their negotiations were a huge capitulation because the Israeli regime is isolated across the world now. Countries, everyone despises the regime. Even Trump admits this. And then at a time when it's becoming isolated, the only country that moves in the opposite direction and strengthens and builds ties with the Israeli regime, not just strengthens ties, builds ties with the regime, is the Lebanese government. And instead of first getting concessions just to sit down with them, because they should make huge demands saying, look, this is going to cost us immensely, and you need us to negotiate with you to be seen as to be acknowledged as legitimate, supposedly. You have to give us the Lebanese concessions. Nothing. They did this for free, and what did they get in return? A day or two later, a lieutenant general in a convoy of the Lebanese army and his companions were murdered. So the more you appease Zionism, the more aggressive the Zionists become. So this capitulation by the Lebanese president and prime minister, and this gifting of southern Lebanon to the Israeli regime, because the Israelis have no intention of ever leaving, and these people know it. This is a huge betrayal of the country. It's treason to if anyone looks at it objectively. Reminds me of 19th century, 18th century imperialism. But it is a violation of the agreement with Iran, the MOU, because in accordance with the MOU, the Israeli regime has to leave, Lebanese sovereignty has to be accepted, and the world war has to come to an end. So this agreement was an attempt to undermine the MOU. Iran is not going to accept that. Iran doesn't care if the Lebanese prime minister and the president sell off their parents. For the only thing that is important for Iran is that the Americans have to carry out Article 1 of the MOU. And until that happens, there won't be normalization in the Persian Gulf. And that's that's literally why the United States ultimately had to accept so many of Iran's conditions, because Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz.
With this deal, though, Professor Marandi, you said it very poignantly that this is a direct violation and an intentional violation of the Memorandum of Understanding. Do you find that one of the key parts of this is to try to plunge Lebanon into such instability that it is very difficult and complicated for Iran then to get involved, as they said they would, if there were violations of this clause? Because Iran has already shown that it will strike Israel for engaging in aggression against Lebanon. But if there is a civil war scenario, if there's a scenario where you have the government against the people, the government against Hezbollah, which in many cases this agreement is really an anti-Hezbollah recognize Israel agreement, that makes things far more complicated, doesn't it?
Hezbollah is very smart. They're very wise. And there have been many occasions in the past where enemies of Lebanon pushed the country towards civil war, and Hezbollah refrained from going there. And the current leader of Hezbollah, the Secretary General, has shown himself to be very, very wise and very smart, and he's managed the organization very well. And on the battlefield, they've also performed very well over the past 2 3 months. The plan is civil war. That's what the Israeli regime wants. They talk about it all the time, and that's obviously a U.S. policy. That's what the U.S. wants to see as well. And at least they want to see the resistance destroyed and Israeli hegemony over Lebanon assured. And have no doubt that if the Israeli regime gets its way, they'll take the whole of Lebanon. The collaborators right now in Lebanon, the wealthy collaborators, if Lebanon were to fall ultimately one day, they'll go to their mansions and palaces in southern France or in Florida or wherever they have they've hidden their wealth. But ordinary people will be refugees. It'll be like the West Bank or Gaza or all those other places where the Israeli regime takes land and uh, and kills uh, the natives living there. So while the Americans are trying to use their proxies in Syria uh, against Hezbollah to some effect, because right now they are shutting the border to prevent Iran from smuggling aid to the resistance from that part of the country. Um, but the Syrian regime is in no position to attack Lebanon. It's a broken regime. It's comprised of all these different terrorist groups, and the government is busy killing factions within these organizations or people within these factions that don't agree with them, and they're also killing minorities, especially on the coast nowadays again. But they don't have the power to go into Lebanon, and if they do, the Iranians will. If the Iranians can defeat the Americans with missiles and drones, it's not going to be a problem defeating the Syrian regime. And of course, the Iraqi resistance would intervene too. So Syria isn't that much of a problem. In Lebanon, the army of Lebanon, half of them at least are sympathetic to Hezbollah and the resistance. At least, but the majority of Lebanese don't support this policy, and they know that the president and the prime minister do not have popular mandate, and everyone knows the intentions of the Israeli regime. So the majority are not with this. I mean, there are those who are anti-Hezbollah, like the sort of ISIS, Al Qaeda type, that are funded by Qatar and Erdogan and these others in the Persian Gulf, and of course the fascists like the Lebanese forces and others who are funded by the West and NGOs and Western embassies and Western intelligence agencies. These are, of course, they support all of this because of their hatred towards the resistance. But most Lebanese don't accept that. So I don't think they can successfully carry out a civil war. And Hezbollah is very careful.
Yeah, well, let me pull up JD Vance, what he is saying, and I want your thoughts on this. This is the narrative the United States is pushing out there after these strikes and after the Lebanon deal. Iran signed a ceasefire agreement. We have honored it. If they have disagreements about how the MOU is being applied, they can pick up the phone, but violence will be met with violence. First, Marandi, the United States has this ceasefire agreement, they said, but yet at the same time lost the definition, it seems, of what ceasefire is.
Oh yes, I mean, in uh, first of all, they've been violating the ceasefire during this whole the last 2 months. They've many occasions, as you and I've discussed in the past, they've bombed the Iranian islands, the Iranian mainland, uh, and on every occasion the Iranians retaliated. And of course, in Lebanon, we saw genocide unfold and ethnic cleansing and mass slaughter and mass and systematic destruction. That wasn't a problem for him. And as we speak, it is going on in Gaza too. The Holocaust there continues, and that is also part of the agreement. Gaza isn't named, but it says a regional end to this violence. So the Americans are violating as I said earlier, the MOU at multiple levels, and they have, I mean, they started this war. They waged war against the Iranian people, unprovoked, illegal. So for them to talk about Iran violating the ceasefire, that's a bit too much. Iran warned a ship not to travel without coordinating with Iran through the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a violation of the ceasefire. And that ship refused to abide by orders from the Navy, and it was hit. So Iran did not strike the United States for the United States to strike Iran.
Now, the United States military is saying that they are ready to provide $30 million, which to $1 trillion albatross is a drop. But nonetheless, they are saying that they want to provide this to the Lebanese armed forces. And Professor Marandi, I don't really know what this means, because the United States ultimately, if they're going to change the calculation here, which is they're going to have to provide some massive support. I don't know what $30 million will buy for the Lebanese armed forces, but ultimately all of this is geared toward what they say is to disarm Hezbollah, which again is only inciting conflict and therefore in violation of the MOU. It's this circle that goes around and around and around.
Yes, of course. This support for the army, they support the Lebanese army not so that it could defend the country, but so that it could attack Hezbollah. They say it all the time. So this is about supporting the president and the prime minister in pushing the country towards civil war. But again, I find it difficult to imagine that it actually happens, and if it does, that it succeeds. Because Hezbollah has massive support in the armed forces, and the armed forces would collapse. And Hezbollah is a very powerful and competent military force, and they have huge popular support. And most people, as I said, don't support this policy of capitulation to the Israeli regime and the gifting of Lebanese territory to Israel, because it's obvious that this regime is not going to back down. So Iran is going to ignore all this. Iran it says that we have an MOU. You want us to normalize trade through the Strait of Hormuz? You have to carry out Article 1. It's as simple as that. And until that happens, there's not going to be an agreement, and there's not going to be normalization in the Strait of Hormuz. So the United States has to make a decision. They can do all they want, make all the agreements what they want with the Israeli regime, but the pressure is going to continue to build, the economic pressure. More ships are moving through the strait than they were 3-4 weeks ago. But the shortages across the world continue to grow at a slower pace, but they continue to grow. And therefore, the United States is by no means out of the woods. And Iran knows that. And until Article 1 is implemented, that's how it's going to be. So what Iran, and I should just add this, what Iran is pushing, and what it has been pushing for the last almost 4 months now, is that it's trying to drive a wedge between the United States and the Israeli regime, trying to push the United States towards economic crisis, so that it ultimately has to prioritize its own interests over that of the Israeli regime, because it's always Israel first. And now the Israelis want one thing, but the Americans see that if they follow the Israeli regime's lead, that it will be devastating for their own economy. That's why they signed the MOU in the first place. That's why they gave all those concessions to Iran. They didn't do it willingly. And the Iranians know quite well that even after they signed it, the MOU, there was no intention by the Americans to carry it out, as we discussed earlier. They've been constantly trying to undermine the MOU. But the Iranians are going to remain steadfast, and they will make sure that until all of its demands are met, some have been met. The U.S. has lifted the siege. A disproportionate amount of the oil that's been exported from the Persian Gulf during the last since the signing of the agreement of the MOU has been Iranian oil.
Yeah.
Huge amounts of Iranian oil. So Iran has been able to make up for a lot of lost exports. But so they've lifted the siege. They've lifted the sanctions on the Iranian energy sector, officially at least. Well, I don't know if it's being actually implemented. Uh, they've spoken about releasing Iranian assets. I don't know how far that's gone, but they clearly have not implemented the deal. And and of course, the issue of Lebanon is the first article. And until it happens, there won't be an agreement. And so the trade through the Strait of Hormuz is going to continue to be much less than it should be.
Well, Professor Rondi, I think it's a good time now to ask you about some narratives I've noticed as these strikes have reemerged, and as the MOU builds on days and now weeks of its signing. There's many more people, the commentariat all over social media, those reporting news, maybe exploiting some news, uh, all talking about Iran losing its leverage, even by mildly opening the Strait of Hormuz and engaging in these talks. And now, with all the evidence, of course, that the United States is not going to be a good faith party to it, as well as, of course, Israel's transgressions, that staying in this and allowing it to go on in the same way it is going is tantamount to losing this leverage. What do you make of that? It's an argument I'm hearing and I'm seeing come up as the days and weeks go by of the United States and Iran, I guess, sort of negotiating, but not really. But at the same time, this is a big statement, and I'm curious on your thoughts about it.
Well, in Iran, also, there's this ongoing debate who support the MOU as it is, and those who say that Iran has been too lenient. And the leader, he made a comment on the MOU, which has broadened that debate, even though his comment is not exactly, I mean, he doesn't explain, he does point out that he's critical of the deal, but he says he gave the Supreme National Security Council and the government a mandate to carry it out. But he was obvious he was critical of it. But he doesn't explain how he's critical, and that, of course, has been discussed behind closed doors, and I'm not privy to that sort of knowledge of what did he want that was not in the agreement. But he was critical. But some people in the country have taken this as like the state is capitulated and this is completely against what he wants. That is not necessarily the case. Although I agree that there are criticisms of the deal. I think those who support the deal, they have good arguments to make, and those who are critical of the deal have good arguments to make. But I don't agree with either side completely, and that's usually how it is for me because I'm not on any political side, and I've been accused from factions of always being affiliated to the other side. With the JCPOA, some people have called me a staunch supporter of the nuclear deal. I never supported the nuclear deal, and they would say I'm allied to those groups, and then supporters of the nuclear deal, those hardcore supporters, would say I'm one of the hardcore opponents of the nuclear deal. I was never a hardcore opponent of the nuclear deal. I just would say there are problems with it, there are shortcomings, uh, but I'm not in any of these political camps. What I think is fair to say is that there are those who would like to see Iran fire missiles and to keep the Strait of Hormuz shut. And that is, it's not, the world is not as simple as that. I mean, first of all, Iran never closed the Strait of Hormuz. It was never fully closed. And there are countries that are friendly to Iran and the axis of resistance that use the Strait of Hormuz. And if we shut them out and shut them down, then maybe their politics would change. So that's one issue. The second is that Iran is itself it was being targeted through the siege, and its own exports and imports were being blocked. And the Iranian people, the right now inflation is very high. It's roughly, I think, something like 68% or 70%. That's very high. Of course, inflation in Iran has always been high because of the maximum pressure sanctions, uh, and the government constantly adjusts the people's wages, government employee wages, the minimum wage, and all that. But it's not easy, and now it's more difficult. So for people to expect, for anyone to expect the the state not to take into consideration the reality of the economic life of ordinary people, I think they're being that's being too naive, that or they're being too simplistic. The government uh, has to function. People have to have jobs. They have to have food. Every supplies have to exist. And so Iran uses the Strait of Hormuz too. Iran was tough. They outlasted the Americans in siege warfare. They compensated to a large degree by using their neighboring countries to import goods, to export what they could, but it made life much more difficult. So Iran has been using this deal to export, um, but also the Iranians continue to enforce to put pressure on the United States through limiting the number of ships that can pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And that's how the Iranian, if it wasn't, if the Iranians didn't have that sort of leverage, the Americans wouldn't have lifted the siege. If Iran didn't have that leverage, the Americans wouldn't have conceded to accepting the sovereignty of Lebanon, and so on, and to ending the war across the region. And so, on the one hand, you have to keep this in mind that Iran has friends, countries like China and other countries that import from and export to the region, but import from the region. They can't just ignore them. They're friends of Iran, and as I said, the Iranians themselves have to uh, continue to keep the economy afloat in order to be able to resist, in order to help the resistance in Lebanon, in order to help. It's not, this. They get support from Iran. We all know that, in order to help Yemen protect itself, in order to help Gaza. It's not as if the resistance in Gaza does not receive, support from thin air. It comes from somewhere. So developing those tunnels and put defense capabilities against further Israeli aggression, all of this costs money. So at the negotiating table, the United States conceded a lot. Is this an ideal situation? Definitely. Am I a fan of this agreement? No. But in general, what I try to do is not to take sides, because when I'm speaking to yourself and others, I'm trying to defend what I think is the people on the right side of history, those who are doing the right thing. And I believe that Iran, in the axis of of resistance, has been doing that. And so if I don't agree with a particular thing that the president said, or a position taken by the chief negotiator, or a critic of the president, or a critic of the chief negotiator, if I don't take a position on that, I think it's because it's not my responsibility. I don't think people outside of Iran really care too much about the details to that degree, as a for their uh, what is important is the fundamental differences that are taking place, that exist between Iran, the United States, the Israeli regime, and then once that is established, we can go into the details about what's going on in Iran. Why is one set of one set of people opposed to the deal? I mean, and why are some supporting the deal? But let me give you a personal example. This was not so long ago. I was speaking with two of my students, or two students. They're not my students, but two students who came to my office, and then a colleague came and said that. you need to do a deal. As if I'm a negotiator, you need to do a deal. The economic situation is difficult, and you have to, don't be so harsh, and try to, find some solution with the Americans. I said, look, I'm not a negotiator. I'm not a decision maker. And he left. And then literally 40 minutes later, I don't know, an hour later or 30 minutes later, another colleague, and those two students were still in the room talking about something completely different, just university stuff. And then this professor was saying, "Why are you conceding so much? Why the Americans? If you keep going down this path, the Americans are going to give nothing, and then they're going to come back for more war." And again, I said that, look, I'm not a negotiator. I'm not a decision maker. So both, different sides make these critiques and assume that I'm involved. But I think that on the whole, while there are problems uh, with this agreement, no doubt, that there are calculations behind it. And Iran's most important um, leverage against the Israeli regime and its occupation in Lebanon, because that's what a lot of people are worried about, obviously, is its ability to put pressure on the U.S. economy. I mean, Iran can lob a few missiles here and there and do damage, but the real pressure is when Iran keeps the Strait of Hormuz uh, half closed. That is what worries Trump, and that's what he said explicitly.
And to your point, Professor Marandi, I think it's important that, and part of the psychological operation I mentioned earlier is to divert attention away from what is happening, especially for shows like this, where audiences tend to be in the United States and the West. It can be very romantic, alluring, attractive to speculate and claim to know that what's going on inside of Iranian politics and leadership and all of this. It distracts away from the actual crisis that the war going and the warmongering parties are experiencing, especially the United States. So you mentioned the economic side of this. You mentioned the geopolitical side of this, where we have multiple fronts that are not going well for the U.S. But then there's also the domestic side of this that is heating up as well. This is Time Magazine that summarized. They summarized just a couple of days ago what the Americans are thinking of the U.S. Iran deal, and some of these numbers are quite staggering. So a Reuters Ipsos poll says just 24% of people in the United States think the war with Iran was worth the cost. Only 23% of respondents, including 50% of all Republican respondents, believe the U.S. is now in a stronger position than before the war started. 35% now think the U.S. is in a weaker position. And to the issue of the deal, it doesn't get much better. 63% of people in the United States in Reuters Ipsos will think it is unlikely the MOU will lead to lasting peace between the U.S. and Iran. So all of these numbers are very damning in the sense that not only is this war very unpopular, but people in the United States are not convinced that this deal will resolve the problems that they're experiencing because of it, which means that we're just a few months from midterm elections, which are going to be a critical part of how the U.S. regime dictates and governs itself over the next several years. And they don't have 6 months, a year plus to correct that situation. So that's a major
I
crisis.
have no doubt. Yeah, I have no doubt that these are things that the Iranians are calculating. The Iranians are looking at U.S. elections. The Iranians are looking at Ukraine. There are multiple things that they're looking at and calculating. And another accusation they made is that the Iranians have sold out Gaza. Of course not. I mean, Ayatollah Khamenei was martyred because of Gaza. Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah was martyred because of Gaza. The war waged against Iran was because of Gaza. The slaughter in Lebanon was because of Gaza. Everyone else is complicit. The governments in Egypt and Turkey and Jordan and the Persian Gulf, and across the world, no one has waging war. No one has even sanctioned. No one has even cut off ties with the regime. Not a single country has cut off diplomatic ties with the Israeli regime. Not a single country has cut off economic ties. Some import gas, some transport.
Oh no, the first time, the first error. Are you still there, Professor Marandi? There we go.
So to make those accusations. This is my
Sorry
cell
for.
phone, and someone called. So uh,
All right.
uh,
Maybe
yeah.
start from where that person before that person
For
called. Yeah.
people, sorry. What was I saying?
Oh, I said maybe start again from where you were before the person
No, but what
called.
was I saying?
Oh, well, that's completely has lost me too because the distraction, it's okay. Continue wherever you want.
Yeah, I was just saying that the war was waged because of Gaza. The war against Hezbollah was because of Gaza, and all these countries in the region, none of them broke off ties with the Israeli regime. None of them uh, broke off political ties. None of them have broken off economic ties. Some import gas, some transport oil, some export oil. They're all doing business, and then Iran is making the sacrifices, and Hezbollah is making enormous sacrifices, and Yemen has made so many sacrifices, and then to say that they've sold out. The Iranians have told Hamas, the political wing, in their discussions, that they will pursue the issue of Gaza in the negotiations, and Hamas is and Palestine is a part of the MOU, though not named, because the war is taking place in Lebanon. But uh, but we have to keep in mind that the ceasefire in Gaza was, because whenever the Iranians say Gaza, the Americans say, well, we have a ceasefire, and everyone's endorsed it. Erdogan and Sisi and the King of Jordan, Abdullah, and all these leaders from the region and beyond, they all went to Sharm el-Sheikh and in Egypt and endorsed Trump's ceasefire and praised him and whitewashed his crimes, and uh, and none of them have complained since, even though well over 1,000 people have been murdered since then. Every day they're bombing and killing more people, children, infants, school children, every day. I don't see any of these governments say anything. It's only Iran paying a price. Yet, I think some people are attacking Iran because in order to cover up their own inaction. Al Jazeera Arabic did a show on Iran. Why is Iran like? Why is it not including Gaza? I mean, what has Qatar done except to fund Kushner and Witkoff and Trump's Trump's sons and gift him an airplane and be a part of.
And that,
You give
and that,
its air base to the United States, its land for the United States to bomb Yemen and Iran and Syria and so on. I mean, who are they to talk about Iran? But Al Jazeera does this in order to undermine the resistance, in order to justify their own role as a proxy of the United States.
in all wars too. It's not even just regionally, which is
Oh,
abhorrent. It's every war. It's Ukraine. It's any following the U.S. line almost to the T on so many critical questions, and ignoring voices that are challenging it, which do exist and are becoming more and more prominent. And I just want to say one last thing because we only have about a minute left, but I wanted to say that. We just had, in terms of that, Russia possibly getting inspiration from Iran and how Iran conducted its response to the U.S. Israeli aggression. We're now still getting information about how bad this damage was that Iran inflicted on the U.S. And now the United States, as I covered yesterday, is considering moving their installations either further west, further away from the Iranian theater, as we might be able to call it, and maybe even underground, which I think is astounding. And so we already are having, obviously, the United States thinking about legitimately reducing its presence, not because they want to, not because of morals or principles or anything, but just because they have to, because of what Iran did. And I think that in and of itself has to be considered. And and just understood better in order to not fall into this, what I think is total folly, which is um, always wanting to impose maximal demands on Iran when in fact everybody, the resistance, everybody who's paying attention, especially the resistance, knows that this is a long, long, long war where there's a lot of factors to take into account. But Professor Marandi, your final thoughts as we head out.
Yeah, there's a long way to go, and this is not over. It's not going to be finished through a few missiles and drones. And
Yeah.
everyone, we shouldn't be easily influenced by uh, empire propaganda. We shouldn't, try to unwittingly strengthen those narratives. Well, we should be more active, do our own bit, each of us, to expose the Israeli regime further. The United States has finally come out and said it's genocide. We knew this for over 2.5 years now, almost 3 years now. But in any case, we have to just keep pushing and pushing, and we're getting there. The Israeli regime has no legitimacy in the eyes of so many people across the world, and now we saw what happened in New York, and how in Jews voted against Zionists in New York. So many, and now the Jews of New York are anti-Semite, apparently, from what I'm reading. It just shows how this is this awakening against Zionism, just like Muslims do not accept Al Qaeda and ISIS and these Takfiri groups. We see increasingly Jews uh, being very open in their opposition to Zionism, and Christians opposed to Zionism. And we have to keep pushing. Everyone has to push, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be difficult, and there are going to be many ups and downs, but we're going to get there.
Yeah, and I want to thank everyone who viewed today, put up the super chats. Thanks so much for those. Everyone who moderated, and of course, anyone who came here. Professor Morandi's X account is in the video description below, where you can find his work and all the interviews and everything else he is doing. Hit that like button before you go. That helps boost the show and YouTube's algorithm. Tomorrow we have June 28th, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We'll have KJ No on the show. Professor Marandi, any words of goodbye to our audience as we head out of here?
No, just we should all pray for the people of Venezuela.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
one of my friends, they've been forced to leave their home because their home it's not clear if it's stable. If people can
Mm.
help them, I mean, we're sanctioned, we can't. We have, but and we have a war going on, but
Right.
we should pray for them, and if we can help in any way or form, I think that it would be a good time to do so.
Yeah, we are seeing, despite what I believe is still a very strong collective preparedness and readiness by the Venezuelan people, the sanctions have taken their toll, and it is a brutal cost that they've paid in this earthquake, and so, or these earthquakes and their aftershocks. So definitely heed those words, everyone. Try to find an organization, try to find people who are legitimately helping, because the United States right now is looking to
Yeah,
consolidate
not through the empire.
power.
Not through
Yeah,
the
be
empire.
careful. They're trying to consolidate their influence and power over Venezuela through this disaster. Capitalism, disaster, imperialism is very much a thing. But nonetheless, heed those words and definitely give them your thoughts and any support you can. All right, everybody, we're going to head out of here.